very much. Thank you. So, yeah, welcome to Philippe and to Joé. Great. Well, glad to present this first session, which I believe is of very hot relevance nowadays. So, why spending time in discussing the impact of regulators on M&A deals? Well, this is because this becomes, as you may have seen, a global trend of more interventionism and more control from regulators on various ways. So the first angle that is a hot topic for Luxembourg as well is the control of the regulator in terms of competition. And I'm glad that today we have a member of the Luxembourg Competition Authority, Lamesch, who will co-present this session with us. Another topic is financial regulations and FDI, and also I'm very happy to share the stage with Philippe Harles from Arendt law firm. And myself, Jean-François Findling from McKenzie. So we will go through, not only the regulations, but also how they are going to practically impact the process of an M&A deal. That's the practical angle that we would like to have. And of course, feel free to interrupt and to raise comments or to have any questions for us. Why the impact of regulators? You may have seen recently in the press, for instance, that in France there is a lot of political emotions with the potential, sale by Sanofi of an asset, pharmaceutical asset, the paracetamol product, to a US private equity fund. That shows how actually states are maybe in the future going to exercise more control and even, make the scope of their control broader than it used to be. So this is what we call the foreign direct investment, and that is one of the angles that, in particular, Philippe will cover. But on top of this, as you are aware, one of the famous control is about competition, ensuring that there is a fair competitive game on the markets. And in that respect, you have, since many decades, of course, the control of the EU regulator, EU Commission, and globally all over the world, so competition authorities that are limiting, restricting the deals. But also a hot topic for Luxembourg, we have recently introduced a bill for a specific local competition control in Luxembourg that is hopefully going to be implemented within the next months or year at least. And finally, also, why is it relevant is because, in fact, when we speak of M&A in Luxembourg, it's often about a company active in the financial industry. And the financial industry is one of the most regulated ones. There is a prudential control of regulators. Let's, of course, think of the CSSF or the Commissariat aux Assurances for the insurance sector, but on top of banks, also all the companies of, the famous PSF, where in fact there will be a heavy control of the parameter of the deals. So that's why it's very important to anticipate, and anticipation will be really one of the key words of this session, is how actually parties of an M&A deal shall anticipate really as early as possible in the stage. So first, before signing, in the context of the due diligence, then when drafting, of course, the contractual documentation, and finally, when we will be speaking of the period between signing and closing with the clearance of the regulator. So I'm going to hand over and to leave the floor to Joé, who will first make a brief description of competition laws in Luxembourg and in Europe.
Yes, thank you. Hello, everyone. So I'm going to talk about the merger control regulation in Europe and also in Luxembourg. And I want to start with just saying a few words about what it actually is. So, of course, it's one of the tools of competition law. As such, merger control is meant to prevent mergers that could have a negative effect on competition by, for instance, creating dominant companies that would raise prices for their clients and consumers. But I think it's most useful to think about it as a huge filtering exercise. Because from the numerous deals that happen every day, actually just a very tiny fraction are indeed problematic. So the big challenge is to identify and review those few cases and let the others go. And I think this is important to keep in mind because actually the incentives of a merging company and of the authorities are the same. Both want to clear unproblematic cases as fast as possible. Firms, of course, because they can go ahead with their plans without much delay, but also for an authority, for the Commission, for instance, it's important so that they can focus their resources on the few cases that are indeed problematic. So how does that work? Of course, the first filtering element is the notification. So there are, maybe we can change the slides. I don't know who has the, or I can continue without it, so also okay. So you have to, one more, thank you. You have to notify a deal to the Commission if certain thresholds are met in terms of turnover. So there are two sets of thresholds in the left-hand column and in the right-hand column. Quick disclaimer, in the right-hand column on the option 2, there's a mistake in the first box, but we'll come to that later. So you have to notify a deal to the Commission if the turnover of all the companies involved on a worldwide basis exceed 5 billion euros. And additionally, if the turnover of two of those companies in Europe exceeds more than 250 million euros. Then that was for the first set. Then there's a second set with lower thresholds, and there's the mistake in the first box. That set is triggered if the combined worldwide turnover of all the companies involved is more than 2 billion euros, and if the combined turnover of those companies in at least 3 member states exceeds 100 million euros. So the second set is not to capture even more deals and make it harder, but in fact, those thresholds capture deals that would otherwise have to be notified in several European member states, making it more complicated. So the idea is to streamline the process and make a one-stop shop for companies. What happens after the notification? The Commission will start to review the case, and there, in fact, happens another filtering element, because in the first phase, it will just merely look if there's indeed a problem. Could there be a problem stemming from the transaction? And if not, it will clear so within 25 working days. And the vast majority of cases, around 95% of cases, are cleared in a phase 1 analysis. And only if the Commission has the suspicion that there could be problems, it will enter a more in-depth investigation, which is called the phase 2 investigation, where it will then take a deeper look at the possible problems and how to solve them. Yes, that's a quick overview of the European system. A few words on the national level. As you may know, Luxembourg is the only country in the OECD that does not have a merger control law. There's a bill in Parliament to introduce one, so it could still change, but at the moment it follows the same logic, the same functioning as the European system to ensure a harmonized legal landscape for companies. The big difference, of course, are the thresholds. So as it currently stands, you would have to notify a deal if the combined turnover of all the firms in Luxembourg exceeds 60 million euros, and if at least two of them have a turnover each in Luxembourg of 15 million euros. These thresholds are for Luxembourg not that high. To give you an idea, they are a bit higher even, or they are not that low. To give you an idea, they are even a bit higher than the ones in Ireland, although the Irish economy is much bigger than ours, of course. And as such, so the impact on deal making would not be too big. An economic study that comes with the bill estimates it to be around 9 to 10 notifications per year that would be triggered with this law. And that's my overview of merger control.
Thank you, Joey.
Thank you, Joey. Welcome, everyone. I think the good news for all the lawyers in this room is that the intervention of the regulators is not only limited to merger control, so there's a lot of work for lawyers. And I think you can maybe just split the intervention of the regulators into two categories. Maybe one more market-centric intervention, whereby the regulators' aim is really to preserve fair competition, to make sure that national security, public order is well maintained. And into that category, you could put FDI, which I will explain a bit more in detail, probably merger control as well, and also the foreign subsidies regime. The second category of intervention of the regulators would be more investor-centric, in the sense that the regulator would more look at the investor itself and try to ensure that that investor is well suited to take over control of a specific company. So with this being said, I think what is really important when you do an M&A transaction is to have a good understanding of what regulatory interventions are being triggered, so that you really have a 360 degree of what and how this could impact your transaction. A lot of people or a lot of clients of us, when they start a transaction, they have maybe one regulatory intervention in mind, but they forget others' intervention. And it's very important to know that the FDI, merger control, they can be cumulative in the sense that one would not necessarily exclude the other, and you would need to go through a number of regulatory approvals before starting your M&A transaction. Once you have identified which regulation applies to your M&A transaction, I think there are a certain number of other questions you need to keep in mind. So first one is really to understand what is the scope of the regulation, how does it really apply to my deal? A second question you always need to keep in mind is about timing. How is timing being impacted on this M&A transaction? Timing means how long does the regulator have time to intervene? When does the legal time period of the regulator start to run? As of what moment is the starting date of this period? And then also, how do you make sure to reflect this in your contractual document? So typically, if you need to undergo regulatory approvals, you would do a separate signing and closing. So you would sign the deal, have a condition precedent provided in your contractual document, in your SPA, to ensure that you will only proceed with closing once the regulatory approvals have been cleared or have been approved. So that's an important point. And so also bear in mind that give yourself always in an M&A transaction, just make sure that you have a sufficiently comfortable long stop date, in the sense that you give yourself a bit more flexibility on the deadline by when all these CPs on the regulatory perspective need to be fulfilled, because sometimes they are just longer than what is provided for by law, because the regulator will only start doing the official or the formal review of the file once you have completed a full file, which is not always the case once you introduce it. I think a last point which needs to be kept in mind is also, what about sanctions? So what kind of sanctions apply if I forget the regulatory approvals, if I don't obtain them, because it can have an impact on your transaction as such, and depending on whether you are the seller or buyer, you may be impacted in a different way by such sanctions. That's really the questions you need to keep in mind when starting an M&A transaction, just to give you a general overview before now talking about maybe two specific kinds of interference from the regulator. The first interference I wanted to talk about is the FDI. So I think it's a previous slide. It's the FDI. What is the FDI? It's a foreign direct investment regime, which is a European regulation, which has also been implemented into Luxembourg law, and which basically foresees that if you are an investor from a non-European country or from a country which is not part of the European Economic Area, and you invest into a Luxembourg company which carries out critical activities and which investment could be a threat to national security or public order, in that sense you would trigger the FDI procedure. So there are a number of, I think, important elements in the scope of the FDI. So you would first need to be a foreign investor, meaning that you're an investor outside the European Union and outside the European Economic Area. You can be an individual investor or an entity. You would then need to take control over a Luxembourg company. By control, you mean that you take over the majority of the voting rights. You would be entitled to vote or to elect to appoint the majority of the board, or you would have any other kind of control over the entity. And the FDI provisions also provides that you are deemed to have control if you are above 25% of the voting rights. So you need to take control, and then the company you take control of must be a company carrying out critical activities. There's a whole list of critical activities in the law on FDI, so I'm not going through these activities, but they range from aerospace to defense, over communication, even certain fields in the financial sector, energy, water. So you can see the list is quite vast. So just make sure that you have also this list in mind when you carry out. And what we have seen so far is that this list is being read in a quite large interpretation. So you would easily or could potentially easily fall within these FDI considerations. And then last but not least, your investment would represent a risk to the national security or public order. So if these conditions are met, you would need to go FDI control. There are two stages to FDI control. The first one is that you will need to notify the Ministry of Economy. The Ministry of Economy then has 2 months to get back to you and to start a scrutiny assessment. If they don't get back to you within the 2 months, you can proceed with your transaction. If they start a scrutiny assessment, then you would need to wait an additional at least 60 calendar days to get a final approval or final decision from the regulator. So here I think it's also a nuance which is important to be kept in mind and which applies to all the regulatory approvals which need to be given, is that sometimes there's a non-objection or sometimes you need to get a formal approval. And this is also important when you prepare your SPA in terms of deliverables under the condition precedent. Sometimes you will not get a formal approval or formal go-ahead from the regulator. They will just maybe not respond at all. So it's important to carefully phrase your CP so that you do not expect a formal approval from the regulator, whereas the regulator would not necessarily give you a formal approval because it's a non-objection procedure. With this, and I see we're running already late, so these are the two procedures or the two phases of the whole procedure which need to be complied. Keep it in mind, because if you do an FDI investment without having the necessary approvals, you will also incur sanctions. The second kind of regulatory approval which will need to, or which can be triggered in certain cases, is the CSSF approval, CAA approval, but there are also other approvals whenever you go above 10, 20, 33 or 50% of voting rights or capital in a company, then you would need to undergo, and you would also need to get the approval from the regulator. This approval is more, as I was saying at the beginning, investor specific. So they would look if you have all, as an investor, if you have the financial soundness, capacities and knowledge to invest into that company. 4 maybe quick takeaways. First one is that it's important to calculate the thresholds, because especially that's important when you have indirect shareholding. It's a non-objection procedure, so you will not necessarily get an answer from the regulator, even though that's quite common in practice. There need to be 3 notifications, one from the seller just to inform the CSSF or CAA, from the target, and then also the buyer itself needs to be approved. The notifications can be done together or can be done separately depending on the deal structure. And I think last but not least, an important point for this context of the LPEA is that private equity funds can also invest into companies which are regulated by the CSSF, etc. So there's no problem in that. Maybe just for the insurance companies, the CAA always wants to have a lead investor who has at least 25% in this transaction and who has the knowledge of the insurance industry. Yeah. So I think that's it, and I will hand over to Jean-François.
Thank you, Philippe. Yeah, we are unfortunately very short in time, and I guess we would deserve the double of the time, as I guess everybody will say. But no, so to now come to the practicalities of the impact and how it will disturb, an M&A deal. Well, that comes at a very early stage, where, for instance, a seller will make the selection of the bidders. Of course, a seller, before entering into a process, would like to have feasibility and certainty. And so, if a seller is likely to face a situation of FDI prohibition, he will probably not select a certain number of bidders. And that is also something that a seller would be wise to also ask at the early stage to bidders, is what are the conditions that actually you foresee will apply to your deal. Of course, verify the threshold that are applicable, but also take this into account in the timing of the transaction. And then let's think of the organization, the practical organization of an M&A deal. So, for instance, in terms of competition, you need to provide to the buyer or to the candidates the reasonably necessary information that they need to make their investment, but not more. So, and in particular, in terms of sensitive information for the competition, you need to make sure that this information will not be disseminated on the market. So there are many tools to do so, but you have to make sure that the information will not be disseminated to all the competitors on the market and at the right time in the process. Not at the early stage. Maybe you will reserve the key contracts or the key information to the final stage of the discussion with the bidders. And of course, you will use all the techniques of NDAs, confidential information, and what we call also, clean room or clean team agreement, making sure that sensitive information are only shared among professionals, not with the operating or executives of the teams. Then, as Philippe also mentioned, a key phase is, what will happen between the time when the parties sign and the closing. In principle, they are forbidden to implement and to share information and to start, of course, the control by the buyer. But in practice, this is not as simple as that. A communication between a buyer and seller is absolutely necessary to prepare closing, and there is the so-called, covenants, and especially negative covenants of the seller during this phase, where the seller will refrain from doing a lot of strategic actions without the consent of the buyer. And that is a critical aspect, which has going to be reasonable, not going too far in this control of the buyer, because if you are going too fast, well, you are doing what we call actually gun jumping, i.e. already implementing the transaction before closing and before the clearance of the regulator. And of course, in this period also, you have to prepare closing. So for instance, in an asset deal for, let's imagine a deal for a bank, well, you have to migrate, you have to prepare the transfer of a lot of data in contracts, and that is also something that makes necessary a coordination between the parties. Finally, I would like to touch base on a few techniques. Of course, a regulator will not necessarily say just yes or no. He might say yes, but yes with that condition, yes if you potentially carve out your business from this activity that we think would make a too heavy burden on the market. So in that respect, parties have to anticipate how they are going to treat that. Various options. One are, very seller-friendly. Seller-friendly will be the typical hell or high water clause, saying that whatever happens, whatever are the conditions, the buyer is obliged to buy at whatever the price will be for him. The reverse can also be the same, can also apply in terms of buyer saying, no, if any condition is posed by the regulator, I'm free to leave and not to pay anything. But intermediary positions can also happen, where the buyer will be, open, will have the possibility to exit, potentially with a certain penalty or a fee to be paid. And in any case, this needs to be anticipated. The buyer will likely want to put certain limits to the conditions. For instance, if the buyer has a key asset, what we will do is, for instance, impose the crown jewel clause, which is to say, okay, I'm happy to sell some of my assets, but not that one who is absolutely key to my business. So we could say many, many things in addition, but I think that this gives you a good insight of the preparation and anticipation of the regulator's control in an M&A deal.